I'm 27. 5 years ago, I lost my mom in a car accident. It wasn't just losing her, it was like losing a part of myself. Dad tried his best, but 2 years later, he remarried. That's when Janet came into the picture. She's 45, blunt to the point of being harsh, and not exactly the warm, fuzzy type. I've tried to coexist with her, but there's always been this tension, especially when it comes to my mom. Janet has this way of minimizing my feelings. Anytime I bring up Mom, she'll roll her eyes or say something like, "You're still stuck on that?" Once, she even told me I was being dramatic for keeping photos of Mom around the house. Dad, ever the peacemaker, avoids conflict. Whenever Janet crosses a line, his response is always, "Just let it go, it's not worth it." Fast forward to last week, the anniversary of Mom's death. It's always a tough day. I usually take flowers to her grave, spend some time there, just reflect. This year, I decided to keep it simple. Just me, some lilies, her favorite, and a quiet moment. Thought I could get through the day unnoticed, but Janet found out. As I was leaving, she walked into the kitchen, saw the flowers, and let out this exaggerated laugh. "Are you really going to cry at a grave again this year?" she asked. Then, as if that wasn't enough, she added, "Pathetic. Grown women should have better things to do." I could feel the anger rising, but I bit my tongue. Dad, who was sitting at the table, looked up briefly but didn't say a word. I gave him this look, silently begging for backup, but he just sighed and went back to his coffee. That was it. I grabbed my keys and left, slamming the door behind me. At the cemetery, I tried to focus on Mom, but Janet's words kept echoing in my head. I thought about how, for years, she'd dismissed my grief like it was some kind of flaw. I thought about Dad's silence, how he never stood up for me, how alone I felt every time this happened. By the time I got home, I'd made up my mind. No more biting my tongue. If Janet wanted to act like my grief was a joke, she needed a wake-up call. The universe, it seems, had its own plans. Just a week after the anniversary, Janet's dog Buster passed away. She'd had him for 10 years, and to her he wasn't just a dog, he was her baby. I came downstairs one morning to find her sitting at the dining table, red-eyed and sniffling, with a photo of Buster in front of her. For the next few days, the house was like a memorial. Janet put up photos, wrote these long emotional posts on Facebook, and even lit a candle in his memory. Dad was all over it, comforting her, telling her it was okay to cry, reassuring her that Buster was in doggy heaven. I didn't say much, not because I didn't care, losing a pet is awful, but because I couldn't shake the irony. This was the same woman who mocked me for grieving my mom, a human being. Watching her fall apart over Buster was like watching karma unfold in real time. The breaking point came at a family dinner a few nights later. Janet was talking about how hard it was to lose Buster, how she missed his wagging tail and the sound of his paws on the floor. Everyone was nodding sympathetically, except me. I just sat there quietly, picking at my food. Eventually, Janet turned to me. "You've been so quiet," she said. "Don't you have anything to say?" I looked up and met her eyes. "Not really," I said. "It's just interesting. When I grieve, it's pathetic. But when it's you, suddenly it's valid." The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Dad stared at his plate like it might offer him an escape route. Janet's face turned red, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. Then she pushed back her chair and left the table without another word. I didn't stick around much longer. I told Dad I needed some air and left. As I walked to my car, I felt this weird mix of emotions: relief, guilt, and something that almost felt like satisfaction. For the first time, I'd stood my ground. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The morning after that dinner, I woke up to a text from Dad. It was short and to the point. "You should apologize to Janet. It wasn't right to embarrass her like that." I read it twice, trying to process the audacity. Apologize for calling out her hypocrisy? I set the phone down and ignored it for the rest of the morning. Later that day, while scrolling through social media, Janet's face popped up on my feed. She'd posted a long, emotional tribute to Buster. There were photos of him over the years, some with captions about how he'd saved her during dark times and was her best friend. The comments were flooded with sympathy. People shared stories about their own pets and offered condolences. I'll admit, it struck a nerve. She could pour her heart out over a dog on social media and get showered with support, but when I expressed grief for my mother, it was pathetic? Inspired, or maybe annoyed, I decided to share something of my own. For the first time in years, I posted about Mom. I shared a photo of her and me from when I was a kid. It was one of my favorites. We were at the beach, and she had this big, carefree smile. In the caption, I talked about what she meant to me, how much I missed her, and how I honored her memory every year. It wasn't meant to be dramatic or attention-seeking, just honest. The response was overwhelming. Friends and family I hadn't spoken to in months reached out. Some shared their own memories of Mom, while others offered kind words. A cousin even called to say how much she admired me for keeping Mom's memory alive. For the first time, I felt like people really understood. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. That evening, Janet cornered me in the kitchen. She had her phone in hand, and her tone was sharp. According to her, my post was a passive-aggressive attack aimed at her. She accused me of using my grief to one-up her loss and said I was trying to make her look bad. I didn't bother engaging. I just walked past her and went to my room. The next day, Dad called a family meeting. He wanted to resolve the tension, but I knew it was just another attempt to sweep things under the rug. We all sat in the living room, me on one side, Janet and Dad on the other. Janet started by saying she felt disrespected, that I'd crossed a line by bringing up the past in such a public way. I couldn't stay quiet. I reminded her of all the times she'd dismissed my grief, the cruel comments she'd made, how she'd mocked me just last week. Janet didn't back down. She claimed it was all in jest, and that I'd taken her words too personally. At that point, I couldn't hold back anymore. I told her how her behavior over the years had made me feel unwelcome in my own home, how her lack of empathy had amplified the pain of losing Mom, and how her double standards were impossible to ignore. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. Dad sat there silent, as ever, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Janet, on the other hand, looked furious. She said I was being unfair, that she'd never intentionally tried to hurt me. I pointed out that intention didn't matter when the result was the same. I felt belittled and ignored every time I tried to share something about Mom. Finally, I laid it out. Unless Janet could acknowledge her actions and make a genuine effort to change, I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I wasn't going to play happy family while she treated my grief like an inconvenience. Janet's eyes welled up with tears. She got up abruptly and left the room, slamming the door behind her. Dad just sighed and muttered something about how he wished we could all get along. I didn't bother responding. After the meeting, I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. I needed space from Janet, from Dad, from the whole situation. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt necessary. That night, as I settled into my friend's guest room, I scrolled through the messages and comments on my post about Mom. Each one reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my feelings were valid, even if Janet refused to see it. This wasn't the resolution Dad had hoped for, but it was a step I needed to take. For the first time in a long time, I was prioritizing my own well-being, and as far as I was concerned, the ball was now in Janet's court. After leaving Dad's house, I didn't go back for weeks. I needed space, and honestly, I wasn't in a rush to deal with Janet again. I stayed with a friend and focused on myself. I picked up extra shifts at work, started going for morning runs, and even booked a session with my therapist, something I hadn't done in months. The first week was quiet. Then mutual friends of Janet started reaching out. One messaged me asking if I could be the bigger person and try to patch things up. Another sent me a long voice note about how hard Janet was taking everything. They talked about how she seemed down lately, not her usual self. I thanked them for their concern, but didn't promise anything. During my therapy session, I laid everything out: the years of tension, the recent arguments, and Dad's constant neutrality. My therapist listened and told me something that stuck. Boundaries aren't about punishing others. They're about protecting yourself. She suggested writing a letter to Janet, not to fix things, but to make my feelings clear and establish those boundaries. That night, I sat down with a pen and paper. I wrote about how her comments over the years had hurt me, how they'd made me feel like my grief wasn't valid. I also mentioned how her loss of Buster could be an opportunity to understand what I'd been going through. It wasn't an attack, just honest and firm. I mailed it the next day and didn't expect much to come of it. For the next week, I kept my distance. I spent more time with friends who understood what I'd been through. We went out for coffee, had movie nights, and even visited the local animal shelter one weekend. A little ironic, considering everything, but it felt good to focus on something positive. Out of nowhere, a small envelope arrived at my friend's place. It was from Janet. Inside was a simple card addressed to my mom. It wasn't anything grand, just a short note saying she was sorry for my loss and hoped Mom's memory brought me peace. It was unexpected, to say the least. I didn't know how to feel about it, but it was the first real attempt she'd made to meet me halfway. Dad called a few days later. He told me he'd started seeing a therapist, too. Apparently, my letter had gotten to him, and he realized he needed to stop being so passive. He wanted to work on being more present for me and for Janet. It was a small step, but hearing that gave me a sliver of hope. A week later, Dad invited me to a small family dinner. He wanted to test the waters, see if we could all start fresh. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. It felt like progress, and I didn't want to shut the door completely. The dinner was awkward at first. Janet seemed nervous, which was a far cry from her usual confidence. She avoided eye contact for most of the evening, but halfway through she spoke up. She admitted that she might have been insensitive in the past and said she never meant to hurt me. It wasn't a full apology, more like an acknowledgement, but it was something. I told her I appreciated her words, but that actions mattered more. Change wasn't about one conversation, it was about consistent effort. She nodded. And for the first time, she asked me about my mom. She wanted to know what she was like, what her favorite hobbies were, how she used to celebrate holidays. It caught me off guard, but I answered. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. As I left, Janet said she hoped we could keep talking. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me cautious optimism. This wasn't the end of the story, but for the first time in years, it felt like a new chapter might be starting. After that dinner, things didn't magically get better overnight, but there was a noticeable shift. Janet started putting in effort, and it showed in small but meaningful ways. A few days later, Dad mentioned that she had joined a local support group for pet loss. He said she came back from the first meeting looking thoughtful, not her usual self. It was clear that hearing others talk about their grief had given her a new perspective. At the next family dinner, she brought it up, sharing some of the stories she'd heard. It was subtle, but I noticed how she was starting to connect her pain over Buster to what I had been feeling about Mom for years. She didn't outright say it, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement in her tone. For once, it felt like she understood that grief isn't something you just get over. The breakthrough came about a week later. I stopped by the house to grab a few things I'd left behind. Janet was in the living room sorting through a box of old keepsakes she'd pulled from the attic. She called me over and handed me something wrapped in tissue paper. When I opened it, I was stunned. It was a framed photo of my mom. The picture was one I hadn't seen in years. It was from a family barbecue when I was a kid. Mom had her arm around me, laughing at something off camera. Janet explained that she'd found it tucked away in an old album and thought I might want it. I wasn't sure what to say, but I thanked her. It was such a small gesture, yet it meant so much. That day, we ended up sitting in the living room, sharing stories. She talked about Buster and how he used to follow her everywhere, even to the bathroom. I told her about Mom's laugh and how she'd always sneak me an extra cookie when Dad wasn't looking. It was the first time we'd ever really connected on a personal level. Even Dad started changing. He seemed more present during our conversations and actually made an effort to mediate when things got tense. At one point, he suggested that Janet and I try a few joint therapy sessions to work on our relationship. I was hesitant at first, but Janet seemed open to the idea, so I agreed. In therapy, we talked about everything: her dismissive comments, my bottled-up resentment, and ways we could move forward. It wasn't easy, but it felt productive. Janet admitted that she'd been wrong to minimize my grief and said she wanted to do better. Hearing those words, especially in that setting, felt like a turning point. As we worked on our relationship, new traditions began to take shape. Janet suggested we create a family ritual to honor lost loved ones, including pets. On her suggestion, we planted a small memory garden in the backyard, with flowers for Buster and my mom. It felt like a step toward healing, something tangible to acknowledge our grief. Other family members started noticing the change in Janet, too. At a cousin's birthday party, she pulled me aside and apologized again, this time in front of a few relatives. She admitted that she'd been insensitive in the past and said she was trying to grow. It was the first time I'd seen her take full accountability, and it meant a lot. That moment gave me the push I needed to share an update on social media. I posted about how things were improving between Janet and me, highlighting the steps we'd taken together. The responses were overwhelmingly positive. Friends and family commented on how proud they were of both of us for working things out. A few weeks later, during a small family gathering, Janet surprised me with another gesture. She asked if we could visit Mom's grave together. I was taken aback, but agreed. We went the next morning, bringing flowers, roses for Mom and a small bouquet for Buster, and sat quietly for a while. Janet didn't say much, but her presence spoke volumes. It was a moment of unspoken understanding, one I never thought we'd share. Over the next few months, the family dynamic shifted in ways I hadn't thought possible. Janet and I started communicating more openly, and Dad became more involved in fostering those connections. We still had our differences, but there was a sense of mutual respect that hadn't been there before. By the time the next anniversary of Mom's passing rolled around, things felt different. We spent the day as a family, visiting the memory garden, sharing stories, and even laughing at some of the funny moments we remembered about Mom and Buster. For the first time in years, the day felt more like a celebration of their lives than a painful reminder of their absence. As I stood in the garden that evening, looking at the flowers we'd planted, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: closure. My grief hadn't disappeared, but it had found a new place in my life, one that didn't feel as heavy. Janet wasn't my mom, and she never would be, but she was trying to be a better version of herself, and for the first time, I believed we could move forward as a family. Part 7. Epilogue: The Healing Rain. The changes between Janet and me weren't dramatic, but they were steady. She was making an effort, and while I appreciated it, I couldn't help but stay cautious. Trust takes time, especially after years of tension. One day, Janet invited me to a pet loss support group she'd been attending. She explained how it had helped her process Buster's death and understand grief in a way she hadn't before. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go. It felt like her thing, but she looked genuinely hopeful about sharing the experience, so I agreed to attend one session with her. At the meeting, I wasn't expecting much. People shared their stories about pets they'd lost, and I mostly listened. Toward the end, Janet spoke up. She talked about Buster and the bond they'd shared, but then she shifted the focus. She admitted to the group that losing him had opened her eyes to the way she'd treated me. She said she regretted her actions and wanted to make amends. Hearing her voice crack as she spoke, surrounded by strangers, was something I didn't expect. It was raw and genuine. Afterward, we grabbed coffee. I opened up about Mom in a way I hadn't with her before, sharing how her loss had shaped me and why her dismissiveness had hurt so much. It was the first time we truly reflected together, and for the first time, I felt like she was listening without judgment. Later that week, Janet brought out an old cookbook she'd found while cleaning the kitchen. Inside was one of Mom's handwritten recipes, a chocolate chip cookie recipe she used to make every Christmas. Janet suggested we try making them together. I hesitated at first, but as we sifted flour and measured chocolate chips, the awkwardness started to fade. While the cookies baked, Janet casually mentioned she'd been collecting little things connected to Mom over the years. She pulled out a small box filled with notes, photos, and even a birthday card Mom had written to me when I was in high school. She hadn't mentioned it before because she wasn't sure how I'd react. I was stunned. The gesture wasn't perfect, but it felt like a genuine attempt to honor Mom's memory in her own way. A few days later, Janet and I visited Mom's grave together for the first time. It wasn't a planned outing. She simply asked if she could join me the next time I went. We brought flowers, roses for Mom and a small bouquet for Buster, and sat quietly for a while. Janet didn't say much, but her presence spoke volumes. It felt like a bridge had been built, one I never thought possible. The changes didn't go unnoticed. At a family gathering, my aunt pulled me aside to comment on how much Janet's attitude had shifted. She mentioned how Janet seemed softer, more understanding, and how the dynamic between us had improved. Other relatives seemed cautiously optimistic, offering quiet support as we worked on rebuilding our relationship. As the holidays approached, Janet suggested dedicating a special moment to honor Mom during our family celebration. I was hesitant at first. It felt a little forced. But the sentiment was genuine. We decided on a small candle lighting ceremony before dinner, where everyone could share a memory of someone they'd lost. It was simple, heartfelt, and surprisingly comforting. Not everything went smoothly. At one point, Janet tried to organize a grief-themed dinner, complete with personal place cards for remembered loved ones. It felt tone-deaf, like she was trying too hard. I told her calmly why it didn't feel right, and to her credit, she listened and adjusted. Instead of making it a spectacle, we focused on the candle lighting ceremony and kept the rest of the evening relaxed. Even Dad stepped up. For years, he'd been the peacemaker, avoiding confrontation at all costs. This time, he took a more active role. He started acknowledging how his inaction had contributed to the rift between Janet and me, and he made a point to support both of us as we worked through things. The real turning point came on a chilly afternoon when Janet and I decided to bake cookies again, using Mom's recipe. As we mixed dough and swapped stories, we couldn't help but laugh at the mess we made. At one point, Janet got flour on her face and pretended to be offended when I pointed it out. It was a light-hearted moment that showed how far we'd come. By the time the cookies were cooling on the counter, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. Janet wasn't my mom, and she never would be, but she was trying to grow from her mistakes. For the first time, I didn't see her as a replacement, but as someone who could still hold a meaningful place in my life. As the years passed, the bond between Janet and me continued to strengthen. We found a rhythm, a shared understanding that honored both my mom's memory and our own unique relationship. The anniversary of Mom's passing became less about sharp pain and more about quiet remembrance, often spent together in the garden we'd planted, sharing stories and laughter. Dad, too, found a new balance, stepping into a more supportive role, acknowledging his past shortcomings and actively nurturing our family connection. The storm clouds of grief and resentment had finally parted, making way for a gentler rain that nourished the seeds of empathy, forgiveness, and a newfound sense of family. We had learned that even in the face of loss and misunderstanding, healing was possible, and sometimes, the most unexpected relationships could blossom in the most unexpected ways. Story 2. I am a 34-year-old single mother of 2 wonderful children, a 5-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. Although things haven't always been easy, I've put a lot of effort into creating a secure and contented home for us. Daniel, my 37-year-old brother, is married to Jessica and has 2 children, a girl who is 7 years old and a boy who is 10. Daniel's life appears to be picture-perfect on paper: a 6-figure corporate career, a large suburban home, and a stay-at-home wife who appears to have everything under control. But believe me, it's not as flawless as it appears. I've never been close to Daniel. He was the golden kid growing up, The person that made my parents proud, received straight A's, and complied with all the regulations. I was the one who was rebelling in the meanwhile. My parents claimed that the child who challenged authority made blunders and brought them gray hairs. Even back then, Daniel enjoyed showing off his accomplishments. He was the type of brother who would leave an A on a test in plain sight to show me how simple perfection was. As adults, our relationship didn't get any better. Daniel has always had a sense of superiority. He loves to seem as though he's giving me advice that will benefit me, but it's always a thinly veiled critique of my decisions when I made the decision to work as a graphic designer for myself. When my son chose to take dance instead of soccer, he informed me it was a recreational job and asked if I considered the example I was establishing for my children. Daniel pretended that I condemned him to a life of harassment. And let's not even talk about the time. He inquired as to if I was putting money aside for treatment because my kid prefers the color black over pink. Daniel alone is that. Things really began to go south at the most recent family get-together. At our parents' place, there was a backyard barbecue, one of the few times when everyone turned up. My children were giggling and having a blast as they ran about with their cousins. Daniel had to say something loud enough for everyone to hear, though, of course. He mentioned that I let my children run amok, and that it's no wonder they don't listen to anyone. As Jessica sat there, presumably thinking comparing my parenting to her color-coded chore sheets and screen time plans, I could feel the criticism from her side eye, but I laughed it off for the moment, because I've learned not to let him get under my skin. They are the epitome of helicopter parents, Daniel and Jessica. They forbid their children from eating sweets, staying up past 7:30, or watching anything that isn't instructive. Their children constantly appear exhausted. Even yet, Jessica consistently shares these Instagram-worthy photos of their family game evenings or do-it-yourself scientific projects. They seem to be growing up in a pressure cooker. Daniel, meanwhile, presents fatherhood as a side career. He works long hours and mostly uses his phone to browse during family gatherings, only interrupting to give commands or scold others. A week or so following the barbecue, uncomfortably, my mother phoned me. She informed me that Daniel had been making some really offensive remarks about me, according to certain members of her extended family. He had apparently been warning others that my erratic lifestyle would damage my children and that I was too lenient to be a father. He even suggested that before it's too late, someone should contact Child Protective Services. I was taken aback. Criticizing me in public is one thing, but bringing up CPS behind my back and saying stuff like that is quite another. That's treachery on a whole other level. My biggest dread materialized a few days later. My door was knocked on and I stood up. 2 CPS employees were present. They claimed to have received an anonymous allegation regarding neglect and dangerous living circumstances. Even though my heart was pounding, I allowed them in. They inquired about my children's nutrition and sleeping habits, and they were courteous, yet inquisitive. They also talked to my lucky son and daughter, who were agreeable despite being perplexed. An hour or so later, the staff informed me that everything appeared to be in order and that the matter will be closed. Nevertheless, I was shocked by the encounter. During the upcoming family gathering, I made the decision to speak with Daniel. I questioned him if he knew anything about the CPS report, but I didn't make any direct accusations. With a sly smile, he said, "Mention that people just care about what's best for the children. Additionally, sometimes an outsider's perspective is necessary to understand the wider picture." I had no choice but to shout. When they learned, my parents were incensed, but they insisted on keeping the family together and refused to sever their relationship with Daniel. Naturally, Jessica defended her husband, saying that their actions were always motivated by love. Because I'm too self-centered to prioritize my children, I realized then that I couldn't rely on them. I began recording everything in my notebook, even every passive-aggressive remark, every dubious aspect of their parenting that caught my attention. I attend family get-togethers. Their children looked more reclusive each time I saw them, so I began to pay more attention to them. I had no idea where this was leading, but I was certain that I would not allow Daniel and Jessica to get away with it. Update. Shortly after the CPS visit, everything began to fall apart. One evening, while going through my messages, I saw a notice from a person I hadn't spoken to in a long time. Before she married Daniel, Jessica had been close to this old acquaintance, but they had grown away. She began by inquiring about everyone's well-being. It sparked my suspicion right away. Then she revealed something shocking. Jessica had been using secret internet forums to whine about her marriage. She seemed to be feeling confined and battling with Daniel's domineering conduct. The communications suggested that Daniel's craving for control went well beyond the children. From their wallets to their schedules, he micromanaged every part of their lives. In one article, Jessica even acknowledged that she occasionally felt more like one of his kids than his wife. The buddy advised me to go through Daniel and Jessica's social media accounts for hints that evening, but she lacked screenshots. The rabbit hole was where I went. Pictures of their ideal family vacations, Christmas feasts, and joyful birthday postings were all over Daniel's social media. However, the more I examined, the more cracks I saw. The children hardly ever smiled spontaneously in the pictures, and Jessica frequently appeared strained. They appeared to be performing for a crowd. Additionally, certain remarks from Jessica's own account were a bit strange. We survived, but she would write things like it was just another hectic week, are constantly filled with pride for my family, statements that seemed to be an attempt to reassure someone, possibly herself, that everything was well. There was no improvement during the subsequent family get-together. Our parents had another barbecue, and Daniel's children were worn out. Every time Daniel raised his voice, even if it wasn't aimed at them, his oldest shuddered while his youngest continued to snooze. They hardly interacted with my children and were quieter than normal. Jessica once revealed to me that her oldest child had been struggling in school when we were in the kitchen together. They had begun visiting a therapist for their nervousness, but Daniel only permitted therapy because the school suggested it and believed it was a waste of time. I was interested in that. I made the decision to learn more after the BBQ. I contacted a mutual friend who was employed at the child's school. She told me that one of Daniel's children had been experiencing anxiety, and a teacher had voiced worries about the strain they appeared to be under, but she didn't go into specifics. In keeping with what I had been observing at family gatherings, the instructor also observed that the youngster frequently appeared worn out and tense. I got back in touch with Jessica's old acquaintance around this time, and she told me more disturbing tales. She informed me that when things didn't go as planned, Daniel had a tendency to shout at his children. Jessica had previously told her that she was afraid of Daniel's rage, but she didn't feel comfortable leaving because she didn't have a job and wasn't financially independent. I was as concerned as the friend seemed to be. Daniel must have realized that I was listening more carefully because he began to attack more forcefully. I had one glass of wine with my meal at the next family dinner. I don't drink much, so that was a rare pleasure. Daniel, ever the opportunist, made a joke about my being the family's resident lush and loudly remarked on how I'm constantly drinking. Even though it was absurd, the way he said it gave the impression that I was an alcoholic. It was another attempt to discredit me in front of the family, and I knew it wasn't simply a jab. I then began reading up on custody laws and the definitions of emotional abuse and neglect. Retaliation was no longer the focus. My concern for my nieces and nephews was sincere. I started documenting everything in great detail. Every insult Daniel uttered, every detail I saw regarding his children's conduct, and even Jessica's subtly revealed information. I started taking notes on things I heard at family gatherings and saved screenshots of social media posts. I considered reporting Daniel to CPS anonymously, but I ultimately chose to hold off until I had sufficient proof. I didn't want to expose him before I could present a convincing argument, or worse, risk having my report rejected. Another family get-together was the last straw. Daniel was in full performance gear as he talked loudly about how his children behaved so well because of his parenting style. Then, without warning, he said that if I didn't improve my parenting, my children would most likely wind up in juvenile detention. There was silence in the room. I glanced at my parents, who were obviously uncomfortable, but they remained silent. One of my cousins later told me that she thought Daniel was emotionally abusing his children, but she was scared to speak out because of how frightening he could be. Shortly afterward, I received a mysterious SMS from Jessica. She called Daniel's actions needless and apologized for it, but as soon as I began to reply, she immediately changed her mind, telling me to disregard the message and that she shouldn't have said anything at all. She was obviously afraid. I became increasingly aware of Daniel's hypocrisy at this time. He often worked late, leaving Jessica to take care of things at home despite his hands-on damage. It was getting harder to ignore the fractures in his flawless exterior. I made the decision to take action in order to safeguard Daniel's children, not to get revenge. It became increasingly evident to me that they were the ones in need of assistance as I gained more knowledge. Update 2. Following the most recent family get-together, I made the decision to stop defending myself and start acting. I spoke with a family lawyer about Daniel's actions, his stunt, and my worries for his children. The attorney gave straightforward counsel after paying close attention. Keep a record of everything, and be fact-driven rather than sentimental. She also told me that Daniel's retribution could not possibly affect my custody of my children as long as I maintained a perfect parenting record. I took her advice and started contacting friends and relatives who had seen Daniel's tantrums. While some were reluctant to participate, others volunteered to provide written remarks, such as my cousin, who had previously confided in me. Every account presented a distinct image. Daniel was domineering, often enraged, and indifferent to his kids' feelings. Additionally, I got back in touch with Jessica's old acquaintance, who provided me with screenshots of Jessica's previous private posts. These blogs detailed her growing sense of loneliness, Daniel's screaming, and his reluctance to make concessions on parenting choices. Things were beginning to fit together. After then, I got the chance to observe things directly. One afternoon, I volunteered to assist Jessica with picking her up from school. She grudgingly consented, perhaps feeling overburdened and in need of the additional assistance. As we awaited the children, a chat between her eldest child and another pupil caught my attention. Dad claimed I was growing fat, so the lad stated I skipped lunch. When I gently questioned Jessica about it after my stomach flipped, she revealed that Daniel had been completely obsessed with the children's eating habits and had even gone so far as to banish snacks from the house. It was the decisive moment. I sent an anonymous complaint to CPS that included all of the information I had recorded. I maintained the emphasis on the children, their nervousness, their seeming fatigue, and the unhealthful strain Daniel appeared to place on them. CPS paid Daniel's house an unexpected visit a few weeks later. However, they did not discover any proof of physical abuse. They arranged a follow-up after observing a significant degree of stress in the home. Daniel's well-manicured persona was starting to fall apart. When he learned about the CPS visit, Daniel was enraged. At a family meal, he came up to me and angrily accused me of being responsible for the story. He stormed off when I denied it while maintaining a neutral demeanor. There was an unpleasant stillness among the rest of the family, but I saw several of them look at each other knowingly. It was evident that more individuals were beginning to realize Daniel's deception. Jessica appeared to be pushed to her limit by the altercation. She arrived at my place a few days later, clearly upset. She publicly acknowledged the state of affairs at home for the first time. Daniel's ranting was directed not just at the children, but also at her. Everything she did, including how she ran the household and dealt with the children's schedules, was condemned by him. She said that she had considered leaving him, but was unsure of how to begin. I provided her with a list of resources, including legal help, financial planning services, and women's shelters. Additionally, I advised her to preserve any documents, emails, and messages that would be useful in the event that she chose to file for divorce. Daniel, meantime, intensified his actions, claiming that treatment was a waste of time and that punishment was the answer to their issues. He pulled his eldest child out of it. This simply made matters worse. More screenshots of Jessica complaining about Daniel's choices were supplied by her old buddy, who had remained in contact with me. Jessica specifically mentioned in the damaging texts how Daniel's activities were harming their children and how helpless she felt to stop it. I also contacted the children's teachers, posing as a worried family member who wanted to make sure the children were all right without digging too much. I advised them to record any issues they saw, Later, after the eldest student lost it during a group assignment, one teacher casually revealed that they had already started taking notes. During the subsequent family gathering, Daniel's public image began to falter. When his youngest child spilled a drink in front of everyone, he lost his anger and yelled at them. The toddler recoiled in obvious fear, and the room fell quiet. Except for Jessica, who silently escorted the children out of the room, my parents were appalled. A few family members later came up to me in private and said that they were beginning to understand what I had been discussing. The moment I received a voicemail was pivotal. We were talking about the resources in it when Jessica unintentionally sent it to me. Daniel called her useless, blamed her for the children's difficulties in school, and chastised her for not managing the children better. The language was demeaning, and the tone was severe. It was precisely the type of proof I required to demonstrate the severity of his actions. Holding the voicemail, I returned to my attorney. She assisted me in creating a strategy that would shield my children and I from Daniel's reprisals, while ensuring Jessica and the kids could receive the assistance they required. Retaliation was no longer the focus. It had to do with safety and responsibility. And for the first time, it seemed as though Daniel's house of cards was going to collapse. The third update came shortly after I got Daniel's voicemail, criticizing Jessica. Things swiftly got out of hand. CPS returned to Daniel's home a few weeks later. It had nothing to do with my report this time. After observing that Daniel's oldest child had been crying in class and expressing a fear of returning home, one of the teachers at his children's school anonymously contacted him. The tension in their home only seemed to increase after CPS conducted another home visit. Even though there was no evidence of physical abuse, the investigator noted the children's emotional distress and marked the case for further observation. The second visit caused Daniel to react explosively. He started pointing fingers at everyone in the family, accusing various people of working with CPS to sabotage him. He went so far as to accuse our parents, who had remained cautiously neutral until this point. His paranoia only served to alienate him further from the extended family. Cousins who once defended him began to quietly distance themselves. Unwilling to be dragged into his drama amid this chaos, Jessica opened up to me again. One evening she showed up unannounced, looking exhausted and stressed. For the first time, she fully admitted that Daniel's abuse wasn't limited to the kids. It extended to her as well. He would belittle her, blame her for anything that went wrong, and control every aspect of their lives, including their finances. She confessed she considered leaving, but felt trapped because she had no savings and no support system outside of the family. It was heartbreaking, but it also gave me a clear path forward. We started quietly building an exit plan for her. First, I helped her research local women's shelters and legal aid organizations. Then we opened a separate bank account in her name, hidden from Daniel, where she could start putting away small amounts of money. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I also put her in touch with my lawyer, who began advising her on the legal steps she'd need to take if she decided to file for divorce and custody. Meanwhile, Daniel began targeting me directly. He cornered me at a family event. His face red with anger, and warned me that he'd make sure I lost custody of my kids if I didn't stay out of his business. I stayed calm, refusing to engage, but I made a mental note to document the interaction. Daniel's threats were empty, but they showed just how desperate he was becoming. Around this time, a new witness emerged. A neighbor of Daniel's approached me at a community event. They overheard a heated argument between Daniel and his oldest child, where Daniel had been shouting so loudly that the neighbor could hear every word through their closed windows. They described the language Daniel used as intimidating, and said it left them concerned for the kids' well-being. The neighbor offered to provide a statement if it was ever needed, which felt like a significant win. The real turning point came at another family gathering. Daniel's oldest child pulled me aside while the adults were distracted. They admitted they felt scared all the time and didn't like going home. When I gently asked if they'd ever told anyone else, they shook their head, looking terrified of the consequences. It was clear they were desperate for help, but they didn't know how to ask for it. A few days later, I decided to confront Daniel directly in a neutral setting. I carefully laid out what I'd observed: his kids' anxiety, Jessica's exhaustion, and the reports from CPS, and tried to reason with him. Instead of listening, he doubled down, accusing me of being a homewrecker who was trying to ruin his family out of jealousy. It was pointless to argue, so I left, knowing that his resistance to accept his actions would only work against him in the long run. As Daniel's unpredictable conduct became increasingly clear, more family members began to side with me. My cousin, who had previously kept her distance, started aggressively supporting Jessica. Even our parents, who had attempted to be neutral for so long, began stepping in to assist the kids, offering to babysit more regularly and gently helping Jessica with tiny errands. With encouragement from all sides, Jessica ultimately took a huge stride forward. She secretly visited with a family lawyer who helped her understand her rights and alternatives. She began compiling her own proof, messages, emails, and even recordings of some of Daniel's tantrums. With my aid, she started creating a custody case that would hold up in court. Then came the breaking point over a family meal. Daniel had a full meltdown. It started over something minor. His youngest child accidentally dropped their cup, but it turned into a full-fledged yelling battle. He raged at Jessica in front of everyone, calling her worthless, and berated his kids until they were in tears. The place was absolutely silent. Everyone to rise to talk. Jessica rose up, took the kids, and went without a word. There was no turning back now. Jessica completed her departure preparations and started drafting the necessary documents to get a divorce and full custody. In the meanwhile, Daniel's children began to refuse to go on family trips, citing fear, and I put together all the material she had gathered, together with my own notes, to build a strong case against him. CPS started making more regular visits and closely monitoring the home. Daniel started to feel more and more alone as the family started to come together in support of Jessica. As we both got ready for what lay ahead, Jessica thanked me for my help and pledged to see the process through to the end. Daniel's well-crafted facade was obviously coming apart. At least for Jessica and the children, the worst was yet to come for him. At last, the future was beginning to appear more promising. When Jessica formally filed for divorce and asked for full custody of the children, it was a turning moment. Emotional abuse, domineering conduct, and a poisonous family atmosphere were all detailed in the court documents. It was the result of months of preparation, obtaining information, and silent resolve. Daniel was caught off guard. As expected, his initial reaction was not introspection. It was revenge. Daniel made an instant attempt to prevent Jessica from accessing their joint bank account. When she tried to buy food for the kids, and her card was denied, she learned this. Luckily, we had expected this action. With my lawyer's assistance, Jessica had already created her own account, and I took over to pay for her urgent needs while she worked to resolve the situation. Even though it was a minor triumph, Jessica felt encouraged to keep going. Daniel continued after that. He called friends and relatives to correct the record as part of a full-fledged smear effort against Jessica and me. He claimed that I had tricked Jessica into leaving him out of retaliation and informed everybody who would listen that her divorce file was a fabrication. He portrayed himself as a victim, claiming that Jessica was too sensitive to be a parent and that he was simply a loving but tough father. The majority of the family had previously witnessed his actual nature, but it was draining. His account was not being believed by those who mattered. Jessica's attorney was quite aggressive when the court case started. The evidence was overwhelming. Teachers who had observed the children's nervousness testified. Screenshots of Jessica's personal grievances against Daniel's domineering conduct, and CPS records regarding the emotional stress in the home. In an attempt to retaliate, Daniel submitted his own custody request, claiming Jessica was unsuitable to be a mother. He even made an attempt to include me, saying that I was planning everything out of envy. Although it was absurd, it demonstrated his desperation. When the children's court-appointed guardian interviewed them, it was the most impactful moment. They both stated that they didn't want to live with Daniel full-time and that they felt safer with Jessica. Their eldest even mentioned how they were afraid of Daniel's ranting behavior. Hearing their opinions strengthened Jessica's argument, and demonstrated that this was more than a simple divorce. The goal was to shield the children from additional danger. I focused on the facts when I was summoned to testify. Daniel has a history of subverting my parenting, as I explained. His children were affected by his erratic temper. I showed screenshots of Daniel's, including the voicemail he had unintentionally left criticizing Jessica. Daniel's attorney attempted to undermine me by suggesting that my tense relationship with Daniel was the reason I was biased. However, the evidence was self-evident. Daniel's attempts to enlist character witnesses failed horribly, and there was no denying the overwhelming amount of evidence against him. Before the trial, the majority of those who had initially volunteered to testify on his side withdrew. Under cross-examination, those who did appear broke down, confessing that they had heard about his tantrums or seen his domineering behavior. They damaged his reputation rather than bolstered his argument. In the meanwhile, the community overwhelmingly supported Jessica. Letters from neighbors, friends, relatives, and teachers attested to Daniel's poisonous atmosphere and her suitability as a parent. Even those who had previously maintained their neutrality started to covertly support her. Daniel was losing control, and the tide was changing. Daniel's outburst during a hearing was the high point of the courtroom drama. He yelled at Jessica and even snapped at the judge after a little argument about scheduling turned into a heated argument. Despite the judge's warning to restrain himself, the harm had already been done. What everyone previously thought was simply reinforced by his fury. Daniel's temper was a big problem, and the children didn't feel comfortable in his house. His actions in court have repercussions for the entire family. At last, those who had been undecided broke up their relationship with him, supporting Jessica. As the day for the ultimate custody decision drew nearer, Daniel felt more and more alone, and his desperation became more obvious. According to Jessica's attorney, she is certain that the judge will find in her favor. In a desperate attempt to take back control, Daniel attempted to undermine me. He attempted to disclose personal information to the family by unearthing old documents from years ago that had nothing to do with the case. It was a pitiful move that had disastrous results. Rather of harming my reputation, it made Daniel appear weak and desperate. I didn't even need to defend myself, and the family's view of him fell even further. I might have said nothing, but his deeds speak louder. We are currently in the waiting phase. There is nothing more we can do, and the custody decision is quickly approaching. The proof has been shown. The children's voices have been heard, and the witnesses have spoken. We have no choice except to wait and pray that justice is served. Whatever occurs, I am certain of one thing. Daniel's time in power is running out. At last, things are beginning to look better for Jessica, the children, and everyone else he has harmed. Update 5. The custody decision was eventually received, and it met all of our expectations. Because of the substantial proof of Daniel's poisonous conduct and emotional abuse, the judge gave Jessica full custody of the children. Daniel was deeply affected by the decision to grant him restricted supervised visits. Before he could even ask for unsupervised visitation, the judge additionally mandated that he take parenting and anger management programs. It was the first concrete step to shielding Jessica and the children from his authority, and a blatant admission of the harm he had inflicted. Daniel did not do well in the aftermath of the decision. His already precarious reputation took a sharp decline following his courtroom outburst. His once respected family and community now recognized him for who he truly was. Even his most ardent supporter began to back off. Without his facade of perfection, it seemed as though everyone now saw that his rigid parenting style was really a front for his harsh and controlling personality. Daniel was embarrassed and left alone. Jessica and the children started their new lives in the meanwhile. In order to keep the children in the same schools, she relocated to a smaller but comfortable house in a nearby area. The transformation happened instantly. They appeared lighter and more liberated. Their oldest, who had battled anxiety and dread, began to open up more at home and in school, as therapy became a regular part of their life. Instructors started to see notable gains in participation and conduct. In the more relaxed, nurturing atmosphere that Jessica established, The youngest also flourished. The remainder of the family was affected by the custody dispute. Two family members who had remained hesitant over the ordeal started contacting me to express their regret for not trusting me sooner. They acknowledged that they had ignored my warnings about Daniel for years, but they were forced to face the reality after witnessing everything. It was sad, but it felt vindicating. Although it was too late to reverse the damage Daniel had created, at least they were now accepting responsibility for their actions. Naturally, Daniel was unable to let things go. By sharing contrived photos of himself during supervised meetings with the children and captioning them with statements about how much he enjoyed being a father, he made an effort to repair his reputation on social media, but he didn't get the reaction he was hoping for. His posts drew suspicion and, in certain situations, open mockery. His efforts to maintain his dignity were obviously not working. His formerly flawless reputation was irrevocably damaged when the community saw through his attempts. Jessica began to flourish in ways that no one could have foreseen. Daniel's control was no longer a burden. She started to experiment with her independence. She began considering returning to school to complete her degree and obtained a part-time job at a local boutique, something Daniel would never have permitted her to do previously. She became a role model for her children in a manner she had never been able to before, as her confidence increased daily. My own family benefited from the custody dispute's outcome as well. We're over the drama. The anxiety that had pervaded every family get-together for years was no longer something my children had to see. They began to flourish in their own pursuits, and our house became a lot more joyful and serene environment. It served as a reminder of the amount of stress Daniel's actions had caused us all. Jessica's old buddy, who was the one who first contacted me with the screenshots of Jessica's posts on the internet, was one unexpected source of joy. After the divorce, she got back in touch with Jessica, supporting her emotionally and even guiding her through the initial stages of single parenthood. It was touching to watch Jessica re-establish her support system and surround herself with those who truly cared about her welfare. Daniel's reputation was not the end of his troubles. Court-ordered seminars, child support payments, and legal bills began to put a strain on finances. He had to drastically reduce his personal lifestyle, giving up the fancy automobile he liked to show off at family events and reducing the amenities he had formerly boasted about. It was a stark contrast to the persona he had worked so hard to uphold, and it further diminished his ability to exert control over Jessica or the children. After a while, CPS dismissed the case and deemed Jessica's house secure. There was no need for additional assistance because the children were doing well. However, Daniel continued to be monitored through sporadic check-ins linked to his supervised visits, sending a strong signal that the system would not allow him to fall between the cracks. Daniel made an effort to patch things up with me in the end. At a family gathering, he came up to me and gave me what seemed like a pathetic apology for what he had done. I listened, but once he was done, I informed him rather bluntly that what he had done was unacceptable. No amount of apologies could make up for the anguish he had caused Jessica, the children, and myself. I was clear that I didn't want to reestablish any sort of contact with him, even though I hoped he would mature and do better. When I think about it all, I can't believe how far we've come. What began as a straightforward family conflict grew into something much more. But justice was done in the end. At last, Jessica and the children are secure, doing well, and not under Daniel's influence. The extended family is beginning to mend, and my own family has found harmony once more. Even though everyone still has a long way to go, I have optimism for the future. We all seem to be progressing according to our own terms for the first time in years, and without the specter of Daniel's shadow. Story 3. I'm Laura, a 47-year-old mother of 2 girls who recently got divorced after a 25-year stressful marriage. For the first time in a long time, I'm living alone. I have Emma, 19, who is just beginning her first year of college, and Megan, 24, who is well into her profession. My girls have been my pillars of support over this whole ordeal because I don't have a large support system. Megan and I are quite close. She has always been the one with whom I could have meaningful chats that go beyond trivial topics. I've confided in her. Additionally, I have attempted to protect Emma from the most of the problems when she was younger. When it came to the divorce, things didn't exactly go as planned. I didn't take a safety net with me. Instead, I'm now having financial difficulties. I haven't told them either, though. It didn't feel right to include them in the chaos that was my marriage, and now my life, since they have always been my little daughters. They should be allowed to be young and live freely without having to bear their mother's responsibilities. The breakup was inevitable. I was no longer able to remain with them, not after everything. I had a long-standing suspicion that someone else was involved. However, I never had the evidence to directly challenge him. I was exhausted by the entire scenario, and he had succeeded in depleting not just our cash, but also my life. Years of reckless spending on his side, together with the divorce's legal costs, left me to pick up the pieces of a financial jigsaw he had torn apart. Without hesitation, he would sling cash about. And now here I am, struggling to make ends meet while counting every dime. One of the most important things I've preserved for my girls is that. However, it's challenging. As if I were the child and Megan were the mom, she constantly checks in on me. Despite her best efforts to hide it, I can tell she's worried about me. Although I detest it, she has always felt accountable for my welfare. Too sophisticated, too self-aware. But Emma is another matter. She appears to somewhat adore her father and remains close to him. I am aware that he has been discussing me with her, things that make me seem like the villain. I know he's been attempting to turn her against me, but he's never overt enough for me to confront him. He seems unable to let go, despite the fact that we are no longer together. I have been sharing tidbits of my experience on Reddit lately under a fictitious name. Telling people something I can't tell my girls is strangely reassuring. Some of their counsel is unexpectedly beneficial, and they listen without passing judgment. Anonymous posting gives me a sense of community, as if there were folks who could relate to my situation. After an especially difficult day, Megan phoned one evening. We spent hours on the phone discussing everything. Well, not exactly everything, if you understand what I mean. I kept her in the dark about her father's actions and financial difficulties. That was still something I wanted to shield her from. I put the phone down after we said our goodbyes and continued with my evening. I was mistaken to believe that the call was over. I discovered later that the call was still active. I fumbled for my phone as my stomach fell, but it was too late. I didn't want Megan to know what she had heard. The financial difficulties and my suspicions about her father were all leaking out in bits and pieces as I walked my room and talked to myself. As I struggled to comprehend what had happened, I got the terrible, sinking sense that I had just broken something for her that I would never be able to repair. I had 100 ideas running through my head. Shall I attempt to explain over the phone? Or should I hold off till she gets in touch? I kind of hoped she would forget it or think it was just a terrible dream. However, a larger part of me knew that would not occur. Megan was too incisive. She had overheard enough to piece together what I had been trying to conceal. She would now understand why I was unable to let go of the past, why I was barely making ends meet. Now I was more than simply her mom. She saw me as an imperfect human being, someone who suffers and has secrets. Either I was too arrogant or too afraid to confess. I'm not even sure whether I want to tell her everything, which is the hardest part. I still have a part of me that wants to protect her from the reality of everything. She'll call me back, I'm sure. She's simply like that. But when she does, what will I say? How can I tell her everything without totally betraying her confidence? I wrote about it on Reddit that evening, and as I typed strangers online, the guilt that was eating at me urged me to prepare myself for a tough talk, and that perhaps, just possibly, this would be a good opportunity to finally be honest with my girls. Now that I have few options, I'm not sure if I trust them, so here I am, waiting by myself in this peaceful house with nothing to keep me company but my thoughts. I'm crossing my fingers that this error won't lose me my daughter's affection. Update 190. My phone rang shortly after I became aware that the call had been left open. Megan was returning the call. I waited a long moment before answering, as if I was hoping the call would simply end, and I wouldn't have to deal with what I knew was about to happen. But there it was. When her name appeared on the screen of my phone, I realized there was no turning back. I inhaled deeply before answering the phone. Megan spoke in a steady, calm tone. There was a hint of something sharp beneath her words, even though I could tell she was trying to sound normal. I could see she wanted answers even if she didn't ask directly. She stopped me as I attempted to ease into it by starting with something light. Though it was quiet, her question pierced through everything. Did the things she heard have any truth to them? I briefly thought about avoiding it, downplaying it, or even lying outright. However, I was aware that it was too late. Any attempt to soften it would only be an insult to her intelligence because she had heard enough to know. Taking a deep breath, I finally told her the truth about her father's financial drain, my suspicion of his affair, and everything else I had been keeping hidden. She was silent for a long time. Then she said something. This time, however, it was different. She sounded as though she was experiencing the world in a totally different way. She told me that she had never thought her father was capable of such a thing. She felt as though everything she knew about him had been completely upended, leaving her with fragments that no longer fit together. I tried so hard to protect her from this pain, but I wanted to reach out and hold her over the phone in some way. My words felt awkward and pointless as I attempted to reassure her and give her an explanation for why I hadn't told her sooner. She remained quiet, simply listening and allowing it to register. Then, as though she were preparing, Megan inquired as to whether the financial situation was as dire as it appeared. She must have assumed there was more to it than just tight. Things I hadn't wanted to admit, even to myself. So I told her. I explained how, during the marriage, her father had spent money as if there were no consequences, how legal fees from the divorce had drained, what little savings I had left, and how I was now just trying to keep my head above water. The weight of it hit her hard. I could hear it in her breathing, see it even though we weren't face to face. That's when she admitted something that broke my heart a little more. She told me she'd been feeling the silent pressure to support me emotionally for a long time, but she hadn't wanted to say anything because she thought I needed her. I could feel the guilt wrapping around me, realizing I placed this invisible weight on her shoulders without even meaning to. I apologized over and over, telling her that wasn't her burden to bear, that she deserved to live her life without worrying about mine. But she surprised me instead of letting it go. She suggested that we should tell Emma the truth together. I could hear the determination in her voice, that fierce protectiveness she'd always had toward her younger sister. She didn't want Emma to be manipulated to believe the things their father was saying about me. She thought Emma deserved to know to make up her own mind. That suggestion threw me. Emma was still so close to her father, and I worried she might not take the news the way Megan had. What if she turned on me, convinced I was just trying to make their dad look bad? I communicated my anxieties to Megan, and she paused before telling me something I hadn't known. Emma, she added, had already been displaying symptoms of stress, behaving aloof, and Megan felt it had something to do with what their father had been saying to her. I could feel the dread coming in, the thought that I'd simply make matters worse by opening out. But Megan sounded so convinced. She told me Emma was stronger than I gave her credit for, and that if we addressed her collectively, she could have a greater chance of understanding. Megan wasn't a kid anymore. She was confident, composed, and focused on what important, making sure Emma knew the truth. After we finished conversing, I rushed back to Reddit, seeking a place to write down all that had just transpired. I sought for guidance, providing just enough for others to comprehend the situation. I informed them about Megan's offer, my anxieties about how Emma might respond, and the strain this was already placing on our family. The comments started pouring in, some advising me to go ahead and be honest with Emma, others cautioned that it may backfire. Everyone seemed to have a different perspective, yet the common thread was evident. My girls had a right to know, therefore that's where I am today. While I'm caught thinking about Emma and all the ways this may go wrong, Megan wants to move forward and face the reality head-on. I'd like to think we can overcome it and emerge stronger on the other side. But at the moment, I feel as though I'm waiting for the next chapter in a tale that has already robbed us of so much. For the time being, I'm clinging to Megan's argument that Emma should be told the truth. If we go to her jointly, I'm hoping that she'll understand and that perhaps, just possibly, this won't shatter us any further. Update. We set up a conversation with Emma a few days following that late-night chat with Megan. Even though it would be challenging, Megan was certain Emma needed to know the truth. Thus, a video call was established. The three of us. In the hopes that this would be the beginning of genuine honesty between us, I prepared myself. Emma's expression seemed happy when it first showed on the screen, as if she wasn't anticipating anything important. She had always been closer to her father, and judging by her easygoing demeanor, I could tell she had no idea what we were going to tell her. Despite feeling as like everything was pressing down on me, I made an effort to concentrate on the here and now, on supporting her steadily. Emma was gently led into the conversation by Megan. She clarified that there were things Emma was unaware of, and that she believed Emma should know, even if they could be difficult to hear. When Emma realized this wasn't a casual call, her grin vanished and her expression became serious. She wanted to know what was happening. There was already a hint of anxiety in her voice. I started out by introducing myself and said that I've been having some financial issues ever since the divorce. Emma's expression contorted, as if she was having trouble understanding what I was saying. She cut me off, wondering why I had kept this a secret and why I hadn't brought it up earlier. I told her I hadn't wanted to concern her since I could tell she was having trouble understanding it. I wanted her to enjoy her life free from the burden of her mother's issues and concentrate on her academics. However, her countenance shifted once again as I talked. She appeared guarded, even irate, and I could understand why. She was already making assumptions, and I could tell that she believed I was only attempting to present her father in a bad light. I then gently informed her that there were other things. I made an effort to keep it as straightforward as possible, but she interrupted me as soon as I brought up how her father's spending had caused stress in our relationship. She shook her head, adamant that her father would never act in such a manner. She began to defend him, claiming that I was exaggerating and that he most likely had valid reasons. She even implied that he had been compelled to spend the money he did, that he was not at fault. As I saw that she was unwilling to listen, I felt my heart sink. Not quite yet. Megan intervened, attempting to give her a clearer perspective. She brought to Emma's attention some of the things she had observed as a child, but had not yet comprehended. Emma, however, would have none of it. As if to protect herself, she pushed back, her voice increasing as she stood up for her father. She accused me of exaggerating and of defaming her father in order to get their approval. It was as though she had been waiting to speak those words, and with every one, I sensed the gap between us widening. Megan was clearly frustrated. She encouraged Emma to consider why she had been feeling compelled to take sides lately, looking her in the eye. Perhaps, just possibly, Dad hadn't been telling Emma the full story, she said. Emma was not interested in hearing it. Insisting that I was only attempting to destroy her connection with her father, she shook her head. She was clearly loyal to him, and it was painful to see how much she had been influenced. The discussions took a turn for the worst. As their voices became louder, Megan and Emma started to argue about whose account of events was more accurate. I made an effort to soothe them and redirect the discussion, but the harm was already done. Emma was determined not to let her guards down. Emma ended the conversation after what seemed like a lifetime. She didn't bid farewell. We were left gazing at a blank screen as she just clicked out. I felt a slight aching in the middle of my chest as I sat there and stared at the blank spot where her face had been. I thought this would help us become closer, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. Megan did not leave the call. She glanced at me with concern on her face, clearly troubled. She feared Emma was more wounded than she was prepared to admit. However, we didn't know how much this entire chat had rattled her. I nodded, not knowing how to react. I couldn't help but question whether or not I had made the wrong decision to include them in my issues. I returned to Reddit later that evening. I inquired whether I had made the correct decision and amended my post to reflect the events. I explained to them Emma's response, how she had blamed me and protected her father. Responses flooded in, offering a variety of suggestions. While some advised me to wait longer, Others comforted me that the best course of action was to be honest. Let Emma discover for herself. I became even more skeptical as a result of the conflicting answers. Emma hasn't replied to my text since we spoke. I tried contacting and reaching out, but none of my attempts have been acknowledged. We are currently separated by a gap that I can sense growing every day. Even though Megan has been encouraging and has been checking in on me, I can sense that she is concerned about Emma. Now, all I can do is wait for Emma to change her mind and see things for what they truly are. However, I can't help but question whether I ought to have kept it all to myself, if attempting to keep her safe has just made matters worse. The third update. It was not long before Emma began to distance herself. I initially assumed she was simply taking her time processing all we had informed her. She needed distance, I kept telling myself, but she would return to me with her questions and be willing to discuss them. However, days went by. A week later, then 2. She didn't contact me. I would SMS you brief messages like, "How are you?" or wish that everything is going smoothly. However, the only answers I would receive, if any, were brief and aloof. She was obviously unwilling to speak, and the longer this continued, the more it seemed like she was vanishing. Megan made an effort to be hopeful. There was something bothering us both that we couldn't ignore, even if she suggested that Emma could simply need some time to realize the truth of the situation. Emma's attitude abruptly changed, as though someone else was telling her to stay away. Megan brought it up at that point. She believed our father was responsible. She had witnessed him do it previously, gently introducing concepts into Emma's mind and causing her to doubt things without explicitly expressing them. And now, since we were at odds, it felt like the ideal time for him to turn her against me. The knowledge struck with a jolt. I kept thinking I was mistaken, but soon I received a mail confirming it. Emma contacted me out of the blue, and it was the coldest tone I'd ever seen her use. She informed me she was sick of being tricked and didn't want to hear any more falsehoods about her father. It was almost as though I could hear his voice repeating his previous charges through her, and the words felt like a smack. He had always been skilled at distorting the facts to make himself appear to be the victim, and it was now obvious that he was doing the same to Emma. Immediately following the message, I attempted to phone her in the hopes that we might discuss it, but she did not pick up. There was nothing when I phoned again and left a voicemail. The stillness continued, and the longer it lasted, the more weight I felt on my chest. Even though I understood that I couldn't make her see things my way, it still hurt. Megan saw the impact it was having on me. She made an effort to cheer me up by telling me that she would always be there for me. She was still with me. She reminded me that Emma was still a young girl, still influenced by her father, and that she would eventually make her own decisions. My lifeline was Megan's support, but even she could tell how much I was having trouble. Emma texted me again a few days later, this time much more aloof than before. She said she didn't want to take sides and requested me not to involve her in my issue. She was obviously affected by her father. She didn't say these things. They reverberated through her as his. It was obvious that I was being manipulated, and every time I chose to stop pushing, it shattered me even more, as much as I learned from it. I came to see that the more I made an effort to connect with her, the more I pushed her away. I resumed posting on Reddit, discussing my difficulties coping with this agonizing distance and inquiring whether anybody else had gone through a similar situation. There was a wide range of replies. I was told to keep contacting Emma to let her know that I was always available. Others argued that it was preferable to allow her room to work things out on her own. A few of the anecdotes people told were personal. They have had traumatic family breakups in which one parent incited the children against the other. Though I couldn't get rid of the pain of knowing that my own daughter, the kid I'd nurtured and loved, was accepting someone else's version of me. Hearing how others handled things provided me some solace. Megan's support helped me persevere. She would visit, assist me with household chores, and ensure that I didn't spend excessive amounts of time alone. She insisted that Emma would eventually see the truth and that this stage would pass. There were times when I thought she was telling the truth, when I could almost see Emma returning and being open to a discussion. On other days, though, I felt powerless and questioned whether this would be our new normal. I then learned through the grapevine that my ex had been telling our extended family untrue things about me. He said that I was insane and that I had been attempting to turn the females against him. Although not totally anticipated, it was a shock. He had always had the ability to change people's minds, and it appeared that he was making every effort to undermine my network of allies. I realized then that I needed to change my attention. I couldn't wait for Emma to come around every day. She could need some time and distance. After putting it off for years, I began researching treatment. Even if my relationship with Emma didn't immediately improve, I wanted to work through my emotions and figure out how to stand on my own. Opening up about everything from the divorce to the current distance with Emma seemed like revealing a wound, so the first therapy session was difficult. However, I left the session with a little, unexpected sense of satisfaction, as if I had made a positive step. It was a beginning, but not a solution. I noticed that I was getting a bit stronger with every workout, looking for methods to rebuild without relying on my girls alone. Emma. I still ached, and silence still stung, and I continued to hope that she would change her mind eventually. But for the time being, I concentrated on my inner serenity and the little triumphs. Update one day at a time. Emma didn't say anything for 4 months. I had become accustomed to the quiet, attempting to concentrate on baby steps toward recovery, and acknowledging that perhaps Emma needed time apart for the time being. Though it was painful, I convinced myself that she would change her mind eventually. Then, one afternoon, I unexpectedly received a text message from her. She asked if we could chat in her quick message. I looked at it for a while, half thinking I was reading it incorrectly or that it was an error. However, I paused before answering with a straightforward, "Of course." Almost instantly, my phone buzzed to indicate that a call was coming in. There she was. Emma's voice sounded much older than when we last spoke, cautious and timid. She began with a few clumsy, obviously uncomfortable remarks. I tried not to push too hard or bring up anything that may cause her to back down in my reply. I gave her space to take her time. She gradually opened up to me, sharing details about her life, classes, and how she had been coping. However, I sensed that she was suppressing something more that was weighing on her. After a lengthy silence, she finally started about her father. She brought up minor things he had done that bothered her. She was beginning to notice things that she had not previously given much thought to. She explained to me how he had been quietly attempting to exert control over her, especially over her money. He had first only given her advice, recommending that she allow him to assist her with budgeting or to aid her with her purchases. Over time, though, she became aware that he was pressuring her more, asking her to keep him informed about every small cost, and occasionally even critiquing her decisions. She said that occasionally he would attempt to guilt-trip her by making her feel as though she had to give him an explanation. He would soften his tone when she asked him questions, saying he was only trying to protect her. But something felt strange. I let her speak without interrupting, just gently nudging her when she hesitated for too long. Subsequently, she acknowledged that she had begun to feel as though she was powerless without his input, and that he would suggest that she was being careless or unappreciative anytime she attempted to distance herself. As she explained this in detail, it became evident that his actions were having an impact on her in ways she had not before recognized. I could hear the hurt seeping into her voice as she talked more. She saw him as an ally, someone she could fully rely on. She was suddenly noticing a different aspect of him than she had anticipated. Emma's voice shifted from one of irritation to one of intense betrayal. She informed me that she felt deceived, as though he had been taking advantage of her and bending her allegiance to suit his own ends. She paused for a while, as though she was taking in what she had just said. Then she apologized, almost grudgingly. She apologized for ignoring me and for accepting all he said without question. She acknowledged that she had made a mistake in her assessment of me, but she had been too preoccupied with his version of events to recognize the reality. Everything felt lighter after hearing her say the words she had been holding back for so long. "I'm sorry." Although I didn't want an apology, It felt good to know that she had reached these conclusions on her own, and that we were once again on the same page. I let her know that I knew she didn't need to feel bad. Given all that had transpired between her parents, it seemed only fitting that she would have trusted him given everything we had all gone through. When Megan joined our call at that precise moment, everything seemed to fall into place. For the first time in a long time, it seemed natural for the three of us to start communicating. Emma listened, nodding in agreement, now seeing the matter from a fresh angle as Megan talked about her experiences and how she had also battled with our dad's influence. We shared amusing anecdotes, experiences, and even minor annoyances that we had all experienced over the years. After months of solitude, the laughing seemed genuine, like a bridge being repaired. Emma and I decided to have a face-to-face meeting after the call. We agreed to spend an uninterrupted weekend together, just the three of us, with Megan joining us. That time was necessary, an opportunity to get back in touch and start over away from the distractions of the outer world. When we did get together, it was that weekend. We had come to a new understanding. Emma was forthright and honest, sharing the portions of herself that still felt confused and the times she questioned me. Although none of us were flawless, I reassured her that it was okay, and that what mattered was that we were back together. She seemed relieved, as if she had finally released the burden she had been bearing before the weekend was over. I posted a brief update on Reddit, stating that Emma had gotten in touch with me, and that we were resolving the matter together. I wrote to express my gratitude for the guidance and encouragement I had received, which had enabled me to keep the door open for Emma despite the challenges. The reactions were touching. As I was finishing the previous piece, people offered words of support and kindness while sharing similar experiences of family reconciliation. For the first time in a long time, I felt at ease. There was a sense of optimism, a conviction that we could go ahead stronger and closer than before, even though nothing was healed or the suffering from the past had disappeared. There will be more difficulties ahead, but I was confident that we would overcome them together since we had already gone through so much. On the fifth update, the three of us got together at my place for the first time in what seemed like an eternity that weekend. Emma and Megan showed up on Friday night. They were carrying their bags, and I could sense the tension and excitement in the air. We hadn't been all together, truly together, without the stress of long-held secrets, for a long time. That first evening, we caught up and discussed little topics to start the weekend off right. We all sensed that this weekend would be different, and while laughter came naturally, there was also a sense of gravity. Once we were comfortable, Emma inhaled deeply and expressed regret for the icy words she had delivered months before. She apologized to me for being so aloof and looked me in the eye. I told her that I understood and had no ill will, but that there was nothing to forgive. Megan proposed that we each take turns discussing our thoughts on the divorce, the years leading up to it, and the subsequent events. Although it felt intimidating, I realized that this was our opportunity to finally resolve the matter. I began outlining my long-standing suspicions, the silent apprehensions and anxieties that had accompanied me throughout the marriage. I told them how their father had drained us emotionally and financially, and I had felt like I was seeing everything fall away, piece by piece. I had held everything to myself for so long, in the hopes that it would protect them from the reality. Emma and Megan both listened carefully, disbelief and grief mixed together on their expressions. Megan was unaware of the extent of my financial difficulties. I outlined everything, including the compromises I had to make after the divorce and the adjustments I had to make in order to survive. Emma claimed she had no idea as she gazed down, obviously taking it all in. She apologized for failing to perceive the reality that had been there the entire time. Emma talked candidly about her personal experience as the evening went on. She described to us how her father's remarks had misled her and how difficult it had been to strike a balance between her allegiance to him and what she was learning. She acknowledged that she had frequently felt conflicted, unable to articulate why things didn't quite make together. Megan expressed her own annoyance, admitting that she had been bitter against their father for years, particularly after seeing the harm his acts had caused. She clarified that she had been hurt to witness the stress he had put on me, and therefore our family. We conversed into the night. Finding bits of knowledge we hadn't previously known gave every one of us a sense of relief. In order to keep myself grounded, I once took out an old letter I had written to myself during the divorce, one I had written in a desperate time. I would share my worries, my rage, and my wish that my family would one day be better. As we were relaxing into this intimate moment, reading it aloud brought tears to our eyes, serving as a reminder of all we had gone through and the perseverance required to get here. A knock on the door was heard. I froze, sensing my ex-husband's unwelcome and familiar presence on the other side. I could tell he had a secret agenda, even though he said he was only checking in on the females. Emma and Megan exchanged glances, both of them realizing at once that this was no ordinary visit. Without hesitation, Emma and Megan confronted him, refusing to back down. They pressed him for explanations of his actions and the ways he attempted to use them against me. He became defensive, dismissing their charges and placing the blame back on me, claiming that I had been brainwashing them. I could see him frantically trying to get back in charge, but Emma, who had previously been his staunchest supporter, made it plain that she no longer shared his perspective. For the first time, I confronted him head-on and told him about the suffering I had gone through and the quiet sacrifices I had made for our family. I felt a strength I had never experienced before. I informed him that we were proceeding without his meddling, and that I would no longer let him to distort the facts. He attempted to deny everything, caught off surprise, but Emma and Megan stood behind me and wouldn't allow him to avoid responsibility. He finally appeared to understand that he could no longer control us. A burden was removed from the room as he departed. A feeling of sudden relaxation and liberation descended upon the three of us as we gazed at one another. We immediately agreed to support one another going ahead and to always be honest about our sentiments, no matter how challenging they may be. I returned to Reddit later that evening to provide one last update. I talked about the tearful weekend, my last run-in with my ex-husband, and the family's newfound closure. I expressed my gratitude to everyone for their counsel, encouragement, and sharing of their experiences, which gave me the courage to face everything. People congratulated us and celebrated the healing we'd fought so hard to achieve in the overwhelmingly positive reactions. A sense of calmness descended upon me as I finished that last post, indicating that we had finally overcome a significant obstacle. Although the scars would remain and we were not flawless, we had discovered a new base upon which to grow. Although I was aware that we might encounter difficulties in the future, I felt optimistic for the first time in a long time. After all this progress, I was finally prepared to go forward with my girls in the direction of a future that felt like it actually belonged to us.